In the dying light of a North African evening, 1943, the desert stretched endless and cruel beneath the fading sun. The sand was quiet now, but only hours earlier it had shaken under the thunder of artillery and the screams of men. Smoke still curled from burned-out tanks, rising like ghosts over the battlefield. Among the wreckage, a small, wiry figure stood beside a jeep, his uniform caked with dust, his hat tilted at an angle that seemed both careless and defiant. His name was Terry de la Mesa Allen, known to every soldier who followed him as Terrible Terry. And in that war-torn landscape, he had become something more than a commander. He was a symbol of survival, chaos, and the raw, unbreakable spirit of the American infantryman. Allen didn't look like a general. He wasn't tall or polished, and he never carried himself with the stiff dignity of most officers. He swore too much, drank too hard, and cared little for rules that didn't make sense in the mud and blood of real combat. He was a soldier's general, the kind of man who slept in a foxhole beside his men and walked through enemy fire as if it were just another inconvenience. To the Germans, he was a ghost, a force of nature that refused to play by the book. To his own superiors, he was a problem they couldn't control. But to his men, he was everything. The legend of Terrible Terry Allen began long before the battlefields of North Africa. Born in 1888 in Fort Douglas, Utah, into a family of soldiers, the Army was in his blood. His father had worn the uniform before him, and Terry was expected to do the same. Yet even from the start, he was a misfit. He failed out of West Point, not once, but twice. The Academy's rigid codes of obedience clashed with his restless energy. He wasn't built for marching in formation or memorizing manuals. But what the Army didn't realize then was that war itself would one day be written in Allen's language, fast, unpredictable, and fiercely human. When the Second World War came, it found Allen already a veteran of the last one. He'd fought in the trenches of France during the Great War, had been wounded and decorated, and had seen men die for inches of ground. But the world he returned to in 1942 was one he barely recognized. The United States had entered a conflict on a scale far beyond anything he had seen before. Armies now moved with machines. Air power ruled the skies, and generals fought their battles from maps and conferences. Allen didn't belong to that kind of war. He belonged to the dirt, the smoke, and the men who fought it face to face. When the Army needed someone to mold raw recruits into killers, they gave him the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. It was a broken formation, made up of green soldiers with no experience and no confidence. Allen turned them into a weapon. He trained them not for parades, but for survival. He tore down every trace of pretense and built them back up with sweat, curses, and faith. "If you can fight beside me, you'll fight beside anyone," he told them. The men loved him for it. They followed him into hell, and many didn't come back, but none ever forgot him. By the time the Americans landed in North Africa in 1942, the Big Red One was ready. They hit the beaches near Oran with Allen at the front, his jeep bouncing over sand dunes under fire. He didn't hide behind orders. He led by presence. "Get moving," he shouted over the gunfire, cigarette clenched between his teeth. "Nobody ever won a war lying down." The Germans, veterans of years of mechanized combat, expected chaos from the new American force. What they got was discipline wrapped in fury. Under Allen's command, the 1st Division fought like a cornered wolf, wild, relentless, impossible to break. In the Battle of Casarin Pass, the U.S. Army suffered one of its worst defeats of the war. Units collapsed, commanders panicked, and the Germans rolled through the passes with brutal precision. But Allen's division held. They bled for every hill, counterattacked through smoke and sandstorms, and refused to give ground. While other formations fell apart, the 1st Red One stood like a wall. When the dust finally cleared, even the enemy had taken notice. German field reports began referring to the Americans under Allen's command as tough bastards who didn't know when to quit. But while his men worshipped him, Allen's reputation among high command was less divine. His disregard for protocol, his heavy drinking, and his open contempt for polished staff officers made him enemies in Washington and London. To General Omar Bradley, he was brilliant but uncontrollable, a man who thrived in war but would never fit in peace. To Eisenhower, he was both an asset and a liability. Allen fights like a devil, but he does it his own way, and God help anyone who tries to stop him, one officer wrote. As the North African campaign dragged on, Allen's legend only grew. In the chaos of Tunisia, he could be found at the front lines, dirt smeared across his face, laughing amid shellfire. One war correspondent described him as a cowboy philosopher who commands by instinct. Another wrote, if hell had a guide, his name would be Terry Allen. The Germans began to fear his division, not just for its skill, but for its unpredictability. They never knew when or where the Big Red One would strike next, and when it did, it came like a storm. By the spring of 1943, the campaign was ending. Tunisia was falling, and the Axis forces were crumbling. By the time the North African campaign came to an end, terrible Terry Allen was both a hero and a problem. His men loved him with the loyalty of wolves. His superiors saw him as a loose cannon wrapped in khaki. In the bars of Algiers and the mess halls of Oran, stories about him spread like wildfire. He rode into battle with a grin. He cursed like a dock worker. He slept in the dirt with his soldiers instead of in tents with officers. He was the kind of general every enlisted man dreamed of and every bureaucrat feared. And in an army suddenly swelling with men and ambition, that made him dangerous. Allen's record spoke for itself. Under his command, the 1st Infantry Division had done what few thought possible. It had faced the battle-hardened Africa Corps and survived. At Kasserine Pass, when newer divisions broke under fire, Allen's Big Red One held the line long enough for the Allies to regroup. His men didn't love him because of his rank. They loved him because he never asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself. He was the first to go forward and the last to fall back. If a soldier was wounded, Allen was there. If supplies ran low, he went without. He called them by name, shared their food, and spoke their language, the language of dirt, exhaustion, and grim humor. A man doesn't fight for flags or speeches, Allen once said. He fights for the guy beside him. That's who I work for. But the very qualities that made Allen beloved in the field made him intolerable in the corridors of command. The war in North Africa had exposed not only the brutality of the enemy, but also the cracks within the Allied leadership. Generals like Omar Bradley and Dwight Eisenhower valued discipline, coordination, and predictability, virtues Allen rarely bothered with. He won battles through instinct and sheer audacity, not procedure. To him, victory was messy, chaotic, and personal. To them, it was supposed to be precise and orderly. Terry Allen does not understand the meaning of military decorum, Bradley once wrote in frustration. Eisenhower admired Allen's fighting spirit, but worried about his disregard for authority. After Kasserine, he wrote in his diary, Allen is a fighter, but he leads a band more than an army. His men will follow him anywhere, but will they follow anyone else? It was a fair question. Allen's charisma was so absolute that his division felt more like a cult than a command. Soldiers wore his name on their helmets, painted Terry's boys on their vehicles, and openly mocked other units. When visiting officers criticized their methods, Allen's men laughed. You want discipline? Our discipline is we don't die. That kind of independence made Allen's division formidable, but it also made higher command nervous. As the Allies prepared for the next step in their campaign, the invasion of Sicily, tensions between Allen and his superiors reached a breaking point. Bradley, now in charge of 2 Corps, was determined to bring order to what he called Allen's Wild West show. Eisenhower, trying to balance politics and pragmatism, warned him to tread carefully. He wins, and we need winners right now. In July 1943, Operation Husky began, the invasion of Sicily. The beaches erupted in fire as waves of American troops stormed ashore under the burning Mediterranean sun. Once again, Allen led from the front, his jeep weaving through shellfire. The Big Red One fought like it always had, with speed, ferocity, and disregard for rules. They advanced across the island through towns and hills, smashing German positions and chasing retreating Italian forces. War correspondents followed him everywhere, scribbling down his words, capturing his swagger. One wrote, "He moves like a man allergic to headquarters." But success only sharpened the knives behind him. Bradley and others accused Allen of letting discipline slip too far. His men, they said, drank too much, looted too freely, and showed little respect for other units. Allen's defense was simple. They fight better drunk than most fight sober. To the press, he was a colorful rebel. To the army, he was a liability wrapped in headlines. The tension exploded after the capture of the town of Troina. Allen's division had fought for days against a stubborn German defense, taking heavy casualties before finally breaking through. It was a victory, but the cost was immense. When Allen visited the field hospitals afterward, he wept. "Too many," he said quietly. "Too many dead for one hill." For Bradley, it was the last straw. He called Allen to headquarters and delivered the blow. "You're relieved of command." Allen stared at him, silent for a long time. Then, with a calm voice, he said, "I didn't think we'd both be fighting the same war."
Terry Allen left Sicily in the summer of 1943 not as a defeated man, but as a wounded lion, bruised by politics, not by war. The ship that carried him away from the Mediterranean theater also carried the echoes of his men's fury. The soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division had fought under him like brothers. Now they watched the horizon swallow their general, feeling as though the soul of their unit was leaving with him. When word spread through the camps that terrible Terry had been relieved, many refused to believe it. Some cursed Bradley's name. Others, quietly, started keeping small mementos, photos, patches, or even spent shell casings from battles Allen had led as relics of the man who'd taught them how to fight and how to live. But Allen didn't spend his exile sulking in the dark corners of retirement. He was too restless, too addicted to the rhythm of combat to stay still. Back in the United States, the Army tucked him away into a training assignment, an act meant as a soft exile, a way to keep him busy without giving him power. Yet even there, among recruits who'd never smelled gunpowder or heard the crack of artillery, his energy was magnetic. He paced the grounds like a caged animal, his voice rough, his language raw, and his lessons brutally honest. "Forget the book," he told the young officers. "You'll find out the enemy doesn't read it either." They listened, wide-eyed, not to a professor, but to a prophet who had seen hell and returned to describe it. In private, though, Allen burned with frustration. He read reports from Europe, watching new battles unfold, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, and each headline stung. The war was being fought without him, and he couldn't stand it. But fate, as always, had a way of calling him back. In 1944, as the Allies prepared for the final push into Germany, General Courtney Hodges of the 1st Army needed a man to command a new division, the 104th Infantry, later known as the Timberwolves. It was a unit of untested men, green and inexperienced, destined for the harsh crucible of European combat. The assignment demanded a commander who could turn civilians into soldiers, men into warriors. And there was only one man everyone agreed could do it. When the call came, Allen didn't hesitate. He accepted instantly, not for redemption, but for purpose. He knew what he was meant to do. When he first met his new division, he didn't give speeches or quote strategy manuals. He simply stood before them, his voice gravelly, his expression carved from experience. "I don't care what you were before you put on this uniform. Now, you're mine, and I don't lose." The 104th trained under Allen with an intensity that bordered on madness. He made them march through the rain at night, crawl through mud, and fight mock battles until they could barely stand. When officers complained about the brutality, Allen snapped back, "Better they bleed now than die later." He drilled one lesson to them over and over: night fighting. While most commanders avoided combat after dark, Allen believed darkness was an ally. The enemy sleeps, we don't. The Timberwolves learned to move silently through forests, to navigate by instinct, and to strike and vanish like ghosts. Within months, they had become a unit that no one recognized. Not raw recruits anymore, but predators. In September 1944, Allen's Timberwolves landed in France. The night air carried the smell of smoke and mud, the echoes of distant gunfire. Allen rode in an open jeep at the head of his column, just as he had in Africa, the brim of his helmet low over his eyes. This time, he mumbled to his aide, "We're going to finish the job." His men followed him into Belgium and Holland, fighting through rain, darkness, and the relentless cold of autumn. They earned a reputation as the night fighters, feared by German units who called them Die Nachtwolf, the wolves of the night. In the battles along the Maas River and the Siegfried Line, Allen's philosophy proved itself. By the spring of 1945, the Timberwolves had become the nightmare of the German army. Under the cold cover of night, they moved with a precision and ferocity that left even seasoned Wehrmacht units shaken. Town after town fell to their silent advance. No trumpets, no fanfare, just the sound of boots on frozen earth and the whisper of orders passed from man to man. They struck when others slept, fought when others hesitated, and disappeared into the darkness before the enemy could recover. They were shadows with rifles, and their legend spread faster than the sound of their gunfire. To the Germans, they were Die Nachtwölfe, the wolves of the night. The tactic had been Allen's idea from the start. He believed that the night was not a danger, but an advantage. If you can see him, he can see you. If you move in the dark, he's already dead. He drilled them relentlessly, teaching them how to read moonlight, how to step without breaking twigs, how to whisper and still be heard. The Timberwolves became a breed apart, soldiers who could feel the presence of the enemy before they saw him. When other divisions set up camp for the night, Allen's men were just beginning to move. They attacked from the flanks, slipped through forests, and ambushed convoys before melting back into the mist. In the eyes of the Germans, they seemed almost supernatural, unstoppable, invisible, inevitable. Allen moved among them like one of the pack. He never stayed behind with headquarters, never gave orders from afar. His jeep was always at the front, his voice always carried through the dark. "Keep moving, keep your head down, don't wait for daylight, it's ours now." His men said he seemed to sense danger before it happened. Once, while advancing through the Reichswald forest, he suddenly stopped a column and ordered them to dig in. Minutes later, a German mortar barrage tore through the trees ahead. "You don't think about luck with him," one sergeant said later. "You just follow. He knows." But it wasn't luck. It was instinct, honed through years of surviving battlefields from Africa to Europe. Allen's mind worked like a predator's, always scanning, always adapting. He had learned to think like the enemy, to anticipate what a frightened, desperate soldier would do next. War, he once told a correspondent, isn't about plans. It's about people. You figure out what they're afraid of, and you use it. And what the Germans feared most by 1945 was the soundless approach of Allen's Timberwolves. The unit's success, however, came at a price. The nights were endless, the tension unbearable. Fatigue became a second skin. Men slept in foxholes clutching their rifles, dreaming of nothing. The constant pressure of night fighting eroded nerves, yet Allen refused to relent. "You can rest when you're dead," he barked. Though he knew the words cut deep.
He had seen too many faces go pale, too many hands tremble in the quiet after a firefight. In those moments, he would kneel beside them, his voice softening. "You're still breathing, son. That's enough." One of the most brutal engagements came in late March 1945, near the town of Cologne. The Germans, desperate to delay the Allied advance toward the Rhine, threw everything they had into the fight: tanks, artillery, and even boys barely old enough to shave. The Timberwolves attacked at night, slipping through the outskirts of the city while shells thundered overhead. Street by street, building by building, they cleared resistance. Allen himself was seen walking calmly through the smoke, shouting orders as if deaf to the chaos. When a mortar shell landed nearby and knocked him off his feet, he stood up, brushed the dust from his jacket, and muttered, "You'll have to do better than that." His men laughed, the tension breaking for just a moment, and then they pushed forward again. By dawn, Cologne was in ruins, its cathedral standing like a broken monument over the ashes. But the Timberwolves had taken it. They crossed the Rhine soon after, and the German resistance began to collapse. Villages surrendered at the sight of them. Prisoners, weary and terrified, whispered that they had heard stories of the Americans who came at night and showed no mercy. Allen didn't celebrate these rumors. He didn't need to. Fear was a weapon, and the enemy had already handed it to him. Even as victory loomed, Allen remained wary. He had lived through too many battles to believe in easy endings. In the final weeks of April 1945, his division discovered the Nordhausen concentration camp, a place where the Nazis had built weapons with slave labor. Inside, they found the remains of thousands, stacked like firewood. Hardened soldiers wept openly. Allen walked through the horror in silence, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. When a young officer asked what orders to give, Allen simply said, "Bury them. Then tell the world what you saw." That night, the Timberwolves held no celebrations.
When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Terry Allen's war did not end. It only changed shape. The Timberwolves, the soldiers who had followed him through the darkness of Europe, began to pack up and go home, their faces hollowed by exhaustion and victory. The world celebrated. Flags waved, newspapers screamed, "Victory in Europe!" But for Allen, it was an ending without closure. He had won every battle that mattered, defied every critic who said he couldn't. Yet in the quiet that followed, he found no peace. The sound of silence unnerved him more than artillery ever had. He walked among his men in the final days of the occupation, visiting hospitals and camps, thanking each soldier personally. "You did your job," he told them. "Now go home and live. That's the only order left." They tried to laugh, to make it light, but they saw something in his eyes, a weariness too deep for words. Allen had spent 3 years carrying an army on his back, living one heartbeat from death every day. Now, with the world at peace, he no longer knew who he was without the noise. When he finally returned to the United States, there were no parades waiting for him. The headlines belonged to Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley, the polished generals of history. Allen's war was a soldier's war, fought in mud, smoke, and shadows, not in strategy meetings or press conferences. He was proud of that, but it hurt all the same. "They forget fast," he told an old comrade. "You win too hard, then are nowhere to put you." Still, he did not disappear. The Army, despite its earlier grudges, could not ignore his results. He was assigned to command U.S. forces in occupied Germany for a time, overseeing the reconstruction of towns his division had once destroyed. It was a strange twist of fate. Allen, the destroyer, now became the builder. He visited schools, spoke to young Germans, and told them that discipline and honor meant nothing without humanity. "You don't have to love your enemy," he said in one speech, "but you have to understand him. Otherwise, you'll fight forever." But the bureaucracy of peace suffocated him. Paperwork replaced battle plans. Meetings replaced firefights. The same officers who had resented his freedom in war now surrounded him with regulations. "They've turned courage into a report," he grumbled.
By 1946, Allen had had enough. He handed in his resignation, packed his bags, and walked away from the Army, without ceremony. It's not my Army anymore. It's theirs now. He moved to Texas, bought a small ranch, and tried to become a civilian. But he was a soldier to the marrow, and the peace he'd fought for refused to let him rest. He spent hours sitting on the porch, smoking cigarettes, staring at the horizon as if expecting the next campaign to appear out of it. He would talk about his men, the Timberwolves, the big red one, like they were still out there somewhere, waiting for his orders. At night, he dreamed of gunfire. Once, when his wife found him awake before dawn, he said softly, "I keep hearing them march." Even in retirement, the legend of Terrible Terry refused to die. Veterans who had served under him sent letters and visited, still calling him Sir even decades later. They never forgot the man who'd fought beside them, who'd cursed and laughed and bled in the same dirt. To them, he wasn't a relic of history, he was family. He made us believe we could do the impossible, one Timberwolf said years later. He made us feel like wolves. In 1949, when the Army restructured and began emphasizing academic training over battlefield instinct, Allen's name was quietly omitted from official honors. It didn't bother him. "The books will forget me," he said, "but the men won't." And he was right. At reunions, they drank to his name, told the stories again, the night marches, the battles, the laughter in the middle of hell. They remembered the way he led, not from behind, but from beside them. For all his glory, Allen remained haunted by the faces of those who didn't come home. "It's the only debt I can't pay," he once said. He visited military hospitals often, unannounced, shaking hands with wounded veterans, bringing them bottles of whiskey and words that mattered. "You're still here," he'd tell them. "That means you won." He refused to let the world romanticize war. "They talk about heroes," he told a journalist once, "but all I saw were scared kids doing their damned best." By the early 1950s, as the Cold War began to tighten its grip on the world, Allen watched with quiet dismay. The new generation of generals spoke in abstractions, strategy, deterrence, nuclear balance. He saw the soul of war slipping away into the realm of machines and theories. "They'll fight from desks next time," he muttered. "No mud, no fear, no heart." It wasn't bitterness, but sadness, a soldier's recognition that the kind of war he knew, the kind of soldier he'd been, no longer had a place in the modern world. When asked once what he thought his legacy was, Allen smiled faintly and said, "I left a mark where it mattered, on the men." To him, that was enough. Medals rust, paper fades, but the men who fought under him carried his lessons in their bones for the rest of their lives. And maybe in the end, that was all any commander could hope for. You could take Terry Allen out of the war, but you could never take the war out of Terry Allen. He had fought it too honestly, lived it too deeply. For him,
by the time the 1950s faded into the next decade, Terry Allen had become a relic in the eyes of the new Army, an artifact from a rougher, bloodier age that no one quite knew what to do with. The generals of the new era wore crisp uniforms and spoke in calculated tones. Their wars fought with charts, policies, and nuclear deterrence. They lived by protocols. Allen had lived by instinct. Yet among the men who had served under him, his legend only grew. They didn't remember him as a commander. They remembered him as the man who had walked through fire beside them and told them they could make it. To understand Allen's legacy, you had to understand his code. He believed that leadership had nothing to do with salutes or ceremony. "A man doesn't follow orders," he'd said once. "He follows example." It was a simple creed, but it had made him one of the most respected field commanders of World War II. He never ordered a man to do what he wouldn't do himself. He treated privates like brothers, officers like equals, and enemies like problems to be solved. He had no patience for fear, and even less for ego. "War," he said, "isn't about glory. It's about getting your men home." His methods, once criticized, became the foundation for the Army's next generation of infantry doctrine. Night fighting, small unit autonomy, and psychological conditioning
concepts Allen had championed in the 104th Division were adopted into U.S. military training in the 1950s and beyond. His belief that soldiers needed to think independently, to fight with initiative instead of waiting for orders, became gospel in a world that was changing too fast for rigid hierarchies. Without fanfare, Allen had reshaped the DNA of the modern infantry. He never bragged about it. In fact, he seemed unaware that he'd changed anything at all. He spent most of his later years quietly in El Paso, Texas, visiting veterans' hospitals, giving talks at small-town VFW halls, and mentoring young officers who sought him out. They would arrive expecting the myth, the terrible Terry of war stories, and instead find a soft-spoken man with tired eyes and a whiskey glass half full. He told them not about victory, but about cost. "You'll read about winning," he'd say, "but you'll live with the ones you lost. Don't ever forget them." When the Korean War broke out, reporters tried to draw parallels between Allen and the new generation of commanders leading men into frozen battlefields. He dismissed it. "That's their war," he said simply. "They'll fight it their way." But deep down, he understood that the kind of leadership he embodied, the raw, intuitive kind, was already disappearing. Modern warfare was becoming a machine, and there was less and less room for the men who led with their hearts instead of manuals. "They're turning soldiers into numbers," he told a friend. "We used to call them by name." Still, there were moments when his fire returned. At reunions of the 1st Infantry Division and the 104th Timberwolves, Allen stood before hundreds of veterans, old, gray, some walking with canes, and for a few hours time rewound. They cheered him as they once had in Africa and France. He called them "my boys," though most were grandfathers now. He remembered names, faces, even small jokes from foxholes 3 decades gone. "You didn't just fight," he told them. "You made history, even if nobody remembers it right." The room would fall silent. Then someone would raise a glass, and Allen would smile that same crooked grin that once steadied nerves on a battlefield. "To the wolves," he'd say, "still hunting." The Army eventually came to recognize what he had been. In military academies, his unconventional strategies were studied in small circles. His leadership style, decentralized, empathetic, relentlessly practical, became a case study for what it meant to command men rather than units. In 1963, when a group of cadets asked him for advice, he said, "There's no secret to it. Be the kind of man you'd want to follow." It was the last lecture he ever gave. Terry de la Mesa Allen died in 1969 at the age of 81. He was buried with full military honors at Fort Bliss National Cemetery, his coffin draped in the flag he had once fought under in 2 world wars. Among those who attended were hundreds of veterans from the Big Red One and the Timberwolves. Some traveled across the country to stand one last time beside the man who had once led them through darkness. When the bugler played taps, the sound carried over the desert air, clear, haunting, eternal. One of his old sergeants whispered, "He never left us, you know. He's just up ahead somewhere, waiting." In the end, Terry Allen's legacy wasn't written in medals or monuments. It was written in the memories of those who had followed him through hell and come out alive. His kind of leadership, imperfect, instinctive, utterly human, reminded the world that wars aren't won by machines or strategies, but by the will of men who refuse to break. Somewhere, in the collective memory of those who fought under his command, his voice still echoes through the dark. Keep moving. Don't wait for dawn. It's ours now.
Terry Allen's war had ended, but his name would not stay buried with him. His blood, his fire, and his defiance carried on in his son, who inherited more than his father's face. He inherited his calling. Brigadier General Terry de la Mesa Allen, Jr., known to his men as Little Terry, grew up in the shadow of the legend. He was born into the army, raised in barracks and bases, and taught that courage wasn't about medals. It was about standing your ground when the world fell apart. As a boy, he had watched his father come home from 2 wars, his eyes haunted but proud, his stories always half told. He learned early that greatness carried a price. By the time the Vietnam War broke out, the younger Allen had become his father's reflection in both brilliance and tragedy. He was every bit as fearless, every bit as relentless. He led from the front, refused to send men where he wouldn't go himself, and treated rank like a burden rather than a privilege. Like his father, he understood that soldiers didn't fight for glory, they fought for each other. "You take care of your men," he told his junior officers, "and they'll follow you through hell." It was the same creed that had defined the elder Allen's Timberwolves a generation earlier. In 1967, during one of the most brutal phases of the Vietnam conflict, General Terry Allen Jr. was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, the same Big Red One that his father had once commanded in North Africa. To the men, it felt like destiny had come full circle. The son of Terrible Terry was back, walking the same path, wearing the same patch on his shoulder. Old veterans from the Second World War wrote letters, telling stories of the father who had once led them into battle, wishing the son luck in a war that was tearing America apart. "You've got the blood for it," one wrote. "Just remember what it cost him." In Vietnam's jungles, that bloodline burned bright. Allen Jr. commanded with the same raw intensity that had made his father famous. He laughed under fire, cursed bureaucracy, and stood shoulder to shoulder with men knee-deep in mud and fear. One sergeant remembered him as the only general who smelled like the rest of us: sweat, smoke, and jungle. But like his father, he was not made for the kind of war Washington wanted to fight. His tactics were aggressive, his loyalty to his men absolute, his tolerance for politics non-existent. In an army increasingly defined by strategy, restraint, and statistics, he was an anachronism, a warrior born in the wrong century. On May 17, 1967, tragedy struck in a way so cruel it felt like myth. General Terry Allen Jr. was killed in action near Saigon when his helicopter was shot down by enemy fire. He died leading from the front, the same way his father had always lived. When the news reached the United States, it sent a shock through the ranks of every soldier who had ever served under the elder Allen. The bloodline of Terrible Terry had ended the only way it could, with courage. At Fort Bliss, Texas, the elder Allen's widow stood at the gravesite of her son beside the grave of her husband. 2 flags, one folded for each Terry, rested in her trembling hands. The father had survived 2 world wars. The son had died in one. Around her, veterans from both generations stood in silence. They understood what no speech could capture, that in the Allen family, duty was not a word, it was an inheritance. The Army honored Terry Allen Jr. with full military rights, and in the years that followed, both father and son became part of the same lineage of warriors, remembered not for rank or titles, but for the way they lived. Together they symbolized a fading breed of soldier, men who led from the front, who believed that courage was measured not in orders given, but in steps taken toward danger. He was his father's son, a Colin at the funeral said. He had that same look in his eyes, the look of a man who refused to die sitting down. For many who served, the Allen name became shorthand for a certain kind of leadership, raw, fearless, unbreakable. It wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. Both men had walked through the fire of their own wars, carrying the same stubborn code, the same refusal to yield. One fought across the deserts and forests of Europe, the other through the jungles of Asia. Different battles, same soul. In military schools, their stories were sometimes told side by side. The father who defied convention and won, the son who followed his blood
and paid the ultimate price. In those stories, there was no bitterness, only continuity. Together, they embodied a truth that soldiers across generations understood: that valor doesn't die with a man, it passes on like a flame. Even now, when cadets at Fort Benning study the evolution of leadership, the Allen legacy lingers between the lines. The lessons are not written in textbooks, they are whispered in the barracks and remembered in the field. Be the kind of leader they'd follow in the dark. The Allen name may have been carved into stone, but its fire never went out. It lives in every soldier who refuses to quit, in every commander who chooses to stand beside his men rather than above them. It lives in the mud, in the fear, in the unbreakable will to move forward.
Years passed and wars changed. The jungles of Vietnam gave way to deserts, and soldiers now fought with satellites and screens instead of compasses and maps. Yet even in this new age of steel and code, the legend of Terrible Terry Allen refused to fade. His story, passed from barracks to battlefield, whispered around campfires by generations who had never met him, became something larger than history. It became a myth, not of glory, but of grit. Of the man who fought the system as fiercely as he fought the enemy, and who never asked for anything he wasn't willing to give himself. In the classrooms of West Point, cadets still study his campaigns, not for their tactics alone, but for their soul. His unorthodox leadership, his belief that trust mattered more than titles, that instinct mattered more than orders, was now considered doctrine in modern counterinsurgency and small unit warfare. The irony was impossible to miss. The same army that once exiled him now taught his methods as gospel. His spirit haunted every manual written since. Every chapter about courage, improvisation, and the psychology of men under fire bore traces of his fingerprints. But Allen's true immortality lived not in the books, but in the people, in the men of the Big Red One and the Timberwolves who never forgot what it felt like to follow him through mud, through fear, through fire. They aged, but when they spoke his name, their eyes still carried the same spark. The look of soldiers who had once followed a man who made them believe they could survive anything. When they gathered for reunions, they told his stories like scripture. The general who cursed like a soldier, fought like a devil, and walked among them like an equal. Some called him reckless, others called him mad, but every single one called him theirs. His gravesite in Fort Bliss became a quiet pilgrimage for those who understood the cost of leadership. New recruits left their unit patches on his headstone. Veterans left canteens, photographs, and cigarettes. Some simply stood there in silence, heads bowed, whispering thanks. "You made us fight harder, even if we never met you," one young sergeant wrote in a note left by his grave. "You made us remember what kind of man we're supposed to be." The Allen legacy reached beyond the military. In American history, it became a mirror for a nation's contradictions. The tension between individuality and obedience, chaos and control, freedom and order. Terry Allen embodied the raw edge of America's fighting spirit, flawed, defiant, and fearless. He was never the perfect soldier, but he was the kind that wars demanded when perfection failed. He didn't fight for medals or applause. He fought because he believed that the men beside him deserved a leader who would never hide behind rank. In that belief lay the essence of his legend. When historians speak of the great generals of World War II, they mention Patton's fire, Eisenhower's diplomacy, and Bradley's intellect. But those who know war, those who have smelled cordite and seen dawn through smoke, speak Allen's name differently. They say it quietly, almost like a prayer. Because Allen didn't just command battles. He taught men how to survive them, how to find humanity in the middle of hell, and how to keep moving when every step hurt. Even now, his voice echoes faintly through the corridors of memory.
It can be heard in every exhausted commander who refuses to give up on his men, in every soldier who leads from the front, in every sergeant who still mutters, "We don't die easy." The world has forgotten many heroes, but not him. Not entirely, because Terry Allen never belonged to history books. He belonged to the dirt, the noise, and the hearts of the men who carried his spirit into every war that followed. Some legends die when the war ends. His didn't. It lived on, in every soldier who kept moving when the world told him to stop, in every commander who led by example, in every moment when courage outweighed reason. As the wind sweeps across Fort Bliss, rustling the flags that line his grave, it's easy to imagine him still there, hat tilted, cigarette dangling, watching the horizon like a man waiting for the next battle to begin. And if you listen closely, you might almost hear his voice again, the same gravel drawl that once echoed across the deserts of Africa and the forests of Europe. Don't wait for orders. Don't wait for dawn. Keep moving. Because legends like Terry Allen don't die. They just march on, into memory, into history, into forever.